From March 4th, 2025 to this exact moment, every bottle of Kentucky bourbon, every case of California wine, every can of American beer has sat locked in Canadian government warehouses, gathering dust, slowly expiring, costing the American spirits industry something it will not recover from quickly. $137 million. That is what Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages dropped to between March 2025 and February 2026. The year before, that same number was $718 million. That is an 81% collapse in a single year. And now Donald Trump is standing in front of cameras calling his 50% tariffs on Canada a fair deal. The liquor ban just proved he cannot call it that with a straight face. If you have never followed this trade war closely before, hit subscribe right now, because this story is about to get much bigger than a bottle of Jack Daniels sitting on an empty shelf in Toronto. This channel covers the financial moves hiding underneath the political headlines that most people never connect together. Now let us go back to exactly where this story starts, because the sequence of events here matters more than anything else. It is February 1st, 2025. Donald Trump signs an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on Canadian imports to the United States. Canada is given almost no warning. No formal investigation, no negotiation period, no procedural consultation. The tariffs land overnight and cover a vast range of Canadian goods entering the American market. Within 72 hours, Canada retaliates. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, still in office at that point, announces 25% Canadian counter tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods. The trade war has its opening salvo. Now, here is where the liquor decision enters, and it is critical to understand exactly how it entered. Canadian provinces control alcohol distribution through government-run liquor boards. This is a fundamental structural fact about how alcohol retail works in Canada. The Liquor Control Board of Ontario, known as the LCBO, is the sole provincial wholesaler for alcohol in Canada's most populous province. It is one of the largest single buyers of alcohol anywhere in the world. On March 4th, 2025, the same day Trump's tariffs formally took effect, Ontario Premier Doug Ford issued a directive. Every American alcohol product, all 3,600 of them, pulled from LCBO shelves immediately. Not tomorrow, not after a review. Immediately. Ford posted on social media with characteristic bluntness. Every year, the LCBO sells nearly $1 billion worth of American wine, beer, spirits, and seltzers. Not anymore. British Columbia Premier David Eby simultaneously directed provincial liquor stores to stop buying American liquor from red states. Quebec's SAQ, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, Newfoundland, and Labrador all followed within days. By the end of March 2025, virtually every Canadian province had removed American alcohol from government-run retail. The images circulated everywhere. LCBO workers in Ontario pushing shopping carts down aisles, stacking bottles of Tito's vodka, Jim Beam bourbon, and Jack Daniels into boxes headed for storage. California Chardonnay labels covered with tape. Bourbon shelves stripped bare. This was not random. This was coordinated, deliberate, and strategically targeted. In yanking American booze from shelves, the provinces hit both Democrat and Republican states simultaneously. California wine, a major Democratic state industry. Kentucky bourbon, a cornerstone of a deeply Republican state economy. Tennessee whiskey, same story. The message to Washington was calibrated. We can cause political pain across your entire political map, not just in one corner of it. The financial data that followed confirmed the move was not symbolic. It was devastating for American producers. According to the United States Census Bureau, wine exports from the United States to Canada dropped by $343 million between 2024 and 2025 alone. That represents a 77% year-over-year collapse in wine exports to a country that had been the single largest customer of American wineries. Read that again. Canada was the #1 buyer of American wine in the world. Then it stopped buying. The Wine Institute called 2025 a catastrophic year of historic loss for American wine exporters. Spirits followed the same trajectory. According to data from the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, American spirits exports to Canada dropped from $238 million in 2024 to just $89 million in 2025, a decline of more than 60% in a single calendar year. Canada had been the second largest export market for American distilled spirits. After the ban took hold, Canada fell to 6th, not 3rd, not 4th, 6th in 1 year from 2nd, and beer exports slid from $47 million to $17 million in the same window. The quarterly numbers are even more revealing about the speed and severity of what happened. In the second quarter of 2025 alone, American liquor exports to Canada dropped 85% compared to the same quarter in 2024. That is not a gradual softening of demand. That is a supply cutoff. And it started producing industrial consequences inside the United States within months. Here is the number that Wall Street should have been watching, but was not. Jim Beam, one of the most recognizable bourbon brands on earth, paused primary production at its main Claremont, Kentucky distillery for all of 2026. That facility alone produces roughly a third of the company's annual output. Jim Beam's parent company cited declining Canadian sales as a central driver of the decision. Think about what that sentence means. One Canadian provincial policy decision contributed to shutting down the flagship distillery of an iconic American brand for an entire calendar year. The New York Times described the closure as a stunning move that underlines the immense challenges facing the American whiskey industry after more than 2 decades of rapid growth. Brown-Forman, the company behind Jack Daniel's and Woodford Reserve, saw its Canadian sales collapse 59% in the 9 months through January 2026. Brown-Forman responded by laying off 650 employees globally. Wild Turkey and Sky Y Vodka, brands owned by Italy's Campari Group, disappeared from Canadian shelves alongside every other American label. The entire American whiskey production pipeline contracted by more than 28% through August 2025 compared to the year before. Kentucky's bourbon industry, a $9 billion sector, was sitting on 16.1 million aging barrels, the highest total ever recorded, with nowhere near enough demand to absorb the supply it had built during the years of global growth. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear did not mince words when asked about the ban. He told CBC News directly, "Canada is Kentucky's #1 trading partner. They have been a good trading partner. But because Trump demeaned them and questioned their sovereignty, they took Kentucky bourbon off their shelves, and it hurts our economy." That is a Republican governor saying those words on the record, not a Democratic senator, not a trade economist, a Republican governor whose state produces the bourbon sitting unsold in Kentucky warehouses while Canadian consumers drink something else. California Senator Adam Schiff sent a personal letter to Quebec Premier Christine Fréchette, asking her to reconsider the province's continued ban on American wine. He wrote that Quebec consumers have historically enjoyed access to a wide variety of American wines, and their absence limits choice while cutting off a $434 million market. He posted publicly that the boycott of California wine is causing devastating harm to wine growers. That is one of the most senior Democratic senators in Washington personally lobbying a Canadian provincial premier to put American wine back on store shelves. Let that image sit for a moment, because it tells you everything about where the power in this dispute actually resided. Now let us look at what happened on the other side of the same equation, because this is the part the White House talking points do not include. While American bourbon sat in locked Ontario warehouses costing the province $8 million in storage fees, Canadian producers were experiencing something entirely different. Quebec's SAQ, in its 2026 annual report, recorded a 69.4% growth in origin Quebec products. Canadian wines, including Quebec wines, grew in popularity and by 2026 ranked ahead of Australian wines in the Quebec market. Ontario's VQA Wines, the province's domestic label program, recorded sales increases of 52% after the ban. Ontario craft products overall were up 35% in the same window. A Quebec distillery called Stadacone launched a direct alternative to the American brand Sourpuss and sold more than 100,000 bottles in 2025 alone. The SAQ's own 2026 annual report recorded that fans of U.S. wines have turned to counterparts from other regions, with customers curious and open to discovering new countries of origin. Austrian wines, Chilean wines, and Canadian domestic labels all gained shelf space and consumer loyalty that was previously held by American brands for decades. This is the part nobody in Washington is willing to say out loud. The longer the American alcohol ban lasted, the more permanently Canadian consumers rewired their preferences. Shelf space, once lost in retail, is extraordinarily difficult to reclaim. Consumer habits, once changed under pressure, do not automatically reverse when the pressure lifts. Canada was not just removing American bottles. It was building an entirely new alcohol consumption culture, one bottle at a time, one Canadian producer at a time. During every week, the trade war continued. Now let us move to July 20th, 2026, because this is where the story takes its most consequential and revealing turn. Donald Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. This is a provision nobody had ever used to impose tariffs. Not once, not during Korea, not during Vietnam, not during the Cold War, not during the financial crisis, not during Trump's first term. The last recorded reference to Section 338 in any official government proceeding was 1949, 77 years of legal dormancy, and now it was being dusted off and fired at Canada. The 3 proclamations each targeted a specific Canadian trade grievance. The first covered alcoholic beverages, the second covered dairy products, the third covered motor vehicles. Each carried the same penalty, 50% additional duties on affected Canadian imports, stacked on top of all existing tariffs already in place, and applying regardless of whether goods qualified for protection under USMCA. That last detail is the one that blindsided every trade lawyer in Washington. A Canadian product with a valid USMCA certificate of origin, a product that, by the terms of the very trade agreement Trump himself once celebrated as historic, still faced the full 50% Section 338 duty. USMCA compliance offered zero protection. The White House published a fact sheet calling the proclamations a defense of American workers and ensuring fair trade. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative issued a press release framing Canada's provincial liquor board restrictions as unreasonable and unequal impositions and discriminations against American alcohol producers. The White House explicitly named the LCBO's March 4, 2025 decision as one of the central acts of Canadian discrimination that justified the new tariffs. This framing is the foundation of Trump's fair deal claim, and it collapses entirely the moment you apply the most basic logic to the sequence of events. Here is what the timeline actually shows. Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods in February 2025, unprovoked, with no formal investigation, no procedural consultation, and no warning. Canada, exercising the most basic principle of reciprocal trade response, retaliated. The liquor ban was Canada's retaliation. It was a response to American aggression, not an independent act of discrimination against American commerce. Then, the Trump administration took Canada's retaliation, labeled it unprovoked discrimination, and used that label to justify 50% Section 338 tariffs, a punishment that exceeds the original offense by a factor of 2. This is not a fair deal. This is a circular escalation trap, where the aggressor labels the defender's response as the original crime and uses it to justify further escalation. There is a legal dimension to this that reinforces exactly how fragile Trump's fair deal framing actually is. Trade lawyers at multiple major American firms, including White and Case and Morrison Foerster, immediately flagged the Section 338 proclamations as legally unprecedented. The statutory foundation is shaky in specific ways that matter enormously to the long-term viability of these tariffs. Section 338 was written in 1930. It predates the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It predates the World Trade Organization entirely. It predates every post-World War II trade institution that governs how modern nations interact commercially. Legal scholar Philip Zelikow of the University of Virginia argued publicly that Section 338 was effectively superseded by the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974, both of which created modern statutory frameworks for addressing foreign trade discrimination with specific procedural requirements. Under Section 301 of the Trade Act, the President must commission a formal USTR investigation before tariffs can be imposed. Under Section 232, official determination of national security threat is required. Section 338 requires none of that. The President acts by proclamation alone, with no investigation, no formal findings, no procedural due process, and 30 days' notice. That legal shortcut is precisely why the White House chose it. Speed and flexibility with zero procedural delay. But the same legal shortcuts that made it attractive make it vulnerable to exactly the same judicial challenge that killed the IEEPA tariffs in February 2026. Canada has already signaled it will pursue challenges through WTO dispute settlement mechanisms and USMCA Chapter 31 dispute procedures simultaneously. Canada has used those Chapter 31 panels successfully against American dairy positions in previous years and produced binding findings the U.S. was required to acknowledge. Multiple American trade law firms expected federal court challenges to Section 338's validity within hours of the August 19th effective date arriving. If courts determine that Section 338 was superseded by later trade statutes, the entire 50% tariff framework collapses, and Trump's fair deal claim collapses with it. Now let us look at what happened between August 19th and August 22nd, because the events of those 4 days are the most illuminating and the most damning for the fair deal narrative. The Section 338 tariffs were scheduled to take effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on August 19, 2026. On Tuesday, just hours before the deadline, Trump announced a 3-day pause. His administration claimed the two sides had a deal. That statement proved to be wrong. There was no deal. What there was a negotiating window with the White House that had already publicly declared it did not care whether a deal got done at all. In the days before the pause, something revealing happened inside Canada's own political structure. Prime Minister Mark Carney reached out to the country's provincial premiers and asked them to prepare to lift the ban on American alcohol. The logic was straightforward. If a deal was within reach, removing the liquor ban was the most visible concession Canada could offer to satisfy the White House's stated grievance. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew said publicly that Carney had effectively told premiers in a briefing there would be no trade deal without a pledge to restock American booze. Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston confirmed the same message. Carney was asking Canadian provinces to surrender their most visible and effective leverage in exchange for tariff relief that had not yet been confirmed. Quebec Premier Christine Frechette held firm. She said publicly that American alcohol would remain off SAQ shelves until an agreement she deemed fair had been negotiated. She was not ready to give away leverage on a promise. Ontario Premier Doug Ford went silent. Normally the loudest voice in any trade dispute, Ford said nothing about the liquor ban during those critical days. His silence was more significant than any statement he could have made. Ford had spent more than a year publicly defending the ban as economic pressure Washington could actually feel. Walking that back without a concrete deal in hand would have been a political reversal of historic proportions. Meanwhile, across the border, American consumers were sending their own signal about the fair deal claim. A poll conducted by Angus Reid in early August 2026 found that nearly 70% of Canadians said they would not buy American alcohol even if it returned to store shelves. This is the number that makes Trump's fair deal narrative structurally impossible to sustain. The United States wants the bottles back on the shelves. Canada's government was willing to put them there. But nearly 3/4 of Canadian consumers had already decided the answer was no. Not because of a government order, not because of a provincial policy, because of how they felt about being treated. Think about what that consumer data actually means in dollar terms. Before the ban, American alcohol generated approximately $965 million in annual Ontario sales alone. The LCBO once listed more than 3,600 products from 35 American states. If those bottles return to shelves tomorrow, the market does not automatically regenerate. The consumers have moved on. They found Austrian wines and Quebec spirits and British Columbia craft beers. They rewired their preferences under 18 months of consistent exposure to alternatives. Even if every government ban lifted overnight, the American alcohol industry would not recover its Canadian market share at previous volumes within any near-term horizon. The Ontario government acknowledged during this period that roughly $2 million worth of the stored American alcohol stockpile had already expired and gone to waste by March 2026. The province had been spending $8 million in total storage costs since the ban began, warehousing bottles of bourbon and wine in climate-controlled facilities, not selling them, watching a portion of them spoil, and still refusing to put them back on shelves without meaningful tariff relief. At the same time, Ontario's domestic wine and craft alcohol sales were recording their best numbers in years. Ontario craft products up 35%, VQA wines up 52%. The ban was simultaneously hurting American producers and growing Canadian ones, which is exactly what a trade retaliation policy is designed to do. The negotiations collapsed late on the night of August 21st, 2026. At 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, August 22nd, the Section 338 tariffs took effect on $20 billion worth of Canadian imports across 554 tariff lines, covering everything from hockey sticks and cement to furniture and clothing. Prime Minister Carney issued a statement that broke the fair deal narrative open with a single sentence. He said, "Canada will match those tariffs dollar for dollar to protect our workers and businesses." Carney said he had suspended negotiations and recalled Canada's negotiating team to Ottawa because last-minute changes in the U.S. proposed terms were unfair, uneconomic, and called into question the reliability of any deal. That last phrase is not diplomatic language. It is a central banker speaking with precision. When Carney says last-minute changes called into question the reliability of any deal, he is saying the United States cannot be trusted to honor its own negotiating commitments inside a 30-day window. That statement goes far beyond the immediate tariff dispute. It travels directly into the credibility of every future agreement Washington tries to negotiate with Ottawa or any other trading partner watching this situation unfold. The U.S. Trade Representative, Jameson Greer, offered a different framing, saying the American offer was forward-looking and included a historic economic and national security partnership. Two completely contradictory accounts of the same negotiations breakdown offered publicly within hours of each other. That is not what the end of a good faith fair deal process looks like. PBS News confirmed what Carney's team disclosed about the final terms Washington was demanding. The United States had introduced last-minute conditions that would have reduced tariff relief for Canadian-made vehicles, restricted Canada's ability to strike independent trade deals with other countries, and weakened protections for Canadian language, culture, and sovereignty. Read that list carefully. Washington was not just asking Canada to lower alcohol tariffs or improve dairy market access. It was asking Canada to surrender its sovereign right to conduct independent foreign trade relationships and to diminish protections for its own cultural identity as conditions of a tariff deal. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who had spent months demanding a harder line against Washington, praised Carney for walking away from that deal. Ford said the rejected terms would have hurt Ontario's auto, steel, and manufacturing sectors. Ford urged Canada to use every tool in our toolbox to fight back. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce called the tariff imposition a body blow to North American competitiveness in a self-defeating trade saga. Their president said Americans will see their costs go up, and Canadians will see customers, investment, and small businesses disappear, both sides absorbing damage. both sides pointing at each other. And somewhere in the middle, the fair deal claim standing completely exposed as the cover story it always was. Now let us go one layer deeper, because there is a financial market story hiding underneath the political headline that almost nobody is connecting. The Section 338 tariffs cover 100% of their scope regardless of USMCA qualification. Legal firms analyzing the proclamations have confirmed that importers of covered Canadian goods, autos, alcohol, dairy, furniture, and the broader category list face a 50% additional duty stacked on all existing tariffs, with absolutely no USMCA relief available. That means some Canadian goods now carry cumulative tariff burdens that exceed 75% when you add Section 232 duties for steel and aluminum products on top. No business model in the world absorbs a 75% overnight cost shock without passing every cent of it to American consumers. Canadian dollar-for-dollar retaliation takes effect September 8, 2026, on a range of American exports, including steel, electronics, and other goods. That is not a distant abstract policy date. That is a date with a dollar figure attached to it in every affected industry's cost structure. American manufacturers who use Canadian steel components in their production lines will see input costs rise. American retailers sourcing Canadian lumber, plywood, and cement for construction projects will see those costs rise. The National Association of Home Builders has consistently warned that tariffs on Canadian wood products raise American housing costs. The United States is already in the grip of a housing affordability crisis in 2026. Adding 50% tariffs on Canadian building materials directly contradicts every stated policy priority about making housing affordable again. There is a structural irony running through this entire situation that nobody in Washington's policy circles is comfortable discussing publicly. Trump's own tariffs on Canada in February 2025 created the conditions that led to the Canadian liquor ban. The Canadian liquor ban created the pretext the White House needed to invoke Section 338. Section 338 created the conditions that collapsed negotiations and produced Canadian dollar-for-dollar retaliation. Canadian retaliation will now hit American industries that were not involved in any of the original disputes, and every round of escalation produces more damage on both sides of the border, while the White House continues to frame the entire cycle as defending fairness for American workers. Here's the market-level number that sophisticated investors are watching right now. The U.S. total goods and services trade with Canada reached approximately $880 billion in 2025, according to Bureau of Economic Analysis data. That is the second largest bilateral trade relationship the United States maintains with any country on Earth. Disrupting it through legally questionable tariffs that override an existing free trade agreement creates a specific kind of market damage that does not show up immediately on any tariff schedule, but accumulates in the places that matter most to long-term economic competitiveness. Foreign direct investment decisions depend on predictable rule of law frameworks. Multinational companies building factories and supply chains in North America are watching whether Section 338 survives judicial review. They are watching whether USMCA protections can be bypassed by presidential proclamation without procedural safeguards. If courts ultimately strike down Section 338, the way the Supreme Court struck down IEPA tariffs in February 2026, that is the second major tariff tool Washington has lost in a single year. The president would have deployed and lost two separate legal authorities for unilateral tariff action within 12 months. That legal erosion fundamentally changes the credibility of every future tariff threat Washington tries to make in any future negotiation, not just with Canada, but with every trading partner watching how this unfolds. The American spirits industry has not fully priced in what 18 months of Canadian market absence actually costs in terms of future revenue trajectory either. Canada was not just a major sales volume market. It was a prestige market that provided pricing power and brand positioning for American whiskey, wine, and spirits at a global level. When Brown-Forman reports that Canadian sales collapsed 59% in 9 months, that loss extends beyond the revenue line on this year's earnings report. It represents relationships with Canadian distributors that may have shifted to alternative suppliers. It represents shelf space that domestic Canadian brands now occupy with growing consumer loyalty. It represents the loss of a market that took American producers decades to build and cannot be rebuilt in a single quarter simply because a government lifts a ban that consumers are prepared to ignore. The Distilled Spirits Council of the United States has been calling for a return to zero-for-zero tariffs since the beginning of this dispute. Their president, Chris Swanger, said repeatedly that their industry thrives in a tariff-free trade environment, and that the Canadian restrictions have been extremely disheartening. What the Discus data actually shows is that American spirits exports were down globally in 2025, not just in Canada. Exports to the European Union fell 12%. Exports to the United Kingdom fell 29%. The Canadian market collapse did not happen in isolation. It happened as part of a global reputational and commercial retreat for American alcohol brands in a world responding to American trade aggression everywhere simultaneously. This is the piece of the fair deal claim that is hardest to defend. A truly fair deal would have started by acknowledging that Canada's liquor ban was a direct and proportionate response to American tariff aggression, not an independent act of discrimination. A truly fair deal would have offered to remove the tariffs that caused the ban as a precondition of asking Canada to remove the ban those tariffs caused. A truly fair deal would not have demanded at the last minute that Canada surrender its right to conduct independent foreign trade relationships as a price of tariff relief. What happened between July 20th and August 22nd, 2026 was not the pursuit of a fair deal. It was the use of a 96-year-old legal provision, never before deployed as a tariff weapon, to pressure a Democratic ally whose only crime was retaliating to American aggression with a measure that actually worked. And here is the final and most important thing to understand about where this stands right now. Even if negotiations eventually resume, even if some framework gets constructed that reduces the Section 338 duties or replaces them with something more palatable, the Canadian alcohol market will never fully look the way it did before March 4th, 2025. That date is the permanent dividing line. Before that date, Canada was the #1 customer of American wineries, the second largest export market for American spirits, a reliably enormous buyer of Kentucky bourbon, California wine, and Tennessee whiskey. After that date, Canadian consumers discovered that they did not miss American alcohol as much as anyone expected, that Quebec could produce spirits worth drinking, that Ontario could grow wine worth choosing, that Austrian Rieslings and Chilean Cabernets were perfectly acceptable alternatives to Napa Valley. Nearly 70% of Canadians say they will not buy American alcohol even if the ban lifts. That is not a government policy, that is a consumer culture shift. And consumer culture shifts, once embedded in 18 months of repeat purchasing behavior, loyalty formation, and identity-level decision-making about what it means to support Canadian products in a moment of national economic pressure, do not reverse because a press conference announces a tentative framework. They take years, sometimes a generation, to undo, if they ever fully undo at all. The White House called this a fair deal. The data says it is a self-inflicted wound dressed up in the language of American economic sovereignty. Jim Beam's Shuttered Distillery in Claremont, Kentucky says it is a self-inflicted wound. The 650 Brown-Forman employees who lost their jobs say it is a self-inflicted wound. The California winemaker, who used to send a truckload of Syrah to Montreal every 6 weeks and now sends nothing, says it is a self-inflicted wound. And the 70% of Canadian consumers who say they are not buying American booze even if it comes back to shelves say in the quietest and most powerful way possible that the wound is now permanent. August 22nd, 2026 is not the end of this story. It is the point at which the cost of calling something fair when it was not became impossible to hide. Canada's dollar-for-dollar retaliation takes effect in September. Legal challenges to Section 338 are building in federal courts. WTO dispute panels are being assembled. The USMCA review has no resolution in sight. And $46.4 billion in U.S. goods trade deficit with Canada sits as the backdrop to a president who says America does not need what Canada has. Every investor watching this story needs to understand one thing above all others. The liquor ban did not just damage American alcohol brands. It demonstrated, in the most commercially concrete terms possible, that Canada has effective economic leverage it is willing to use, that Canadian consumers will follow their government's lead when they believe the cause is just, and that once trade relationships are disrupted at the consumer behavior level, the financial damage outlasts the policy that caused it by years. That is the real story beneath the press conferences, the tariff schedules, and the broken negotiating sessions. And that is the story Wall Street has not fully priced into its models yet. If this breakdown helped you see what is actually happening behind the headlines, subscribe right now. This channel connects the financial dots the evening news leaves scattered on the floor. Drop a comment below and tell us the one thing you want to know most. Do you think Canada's consumer boycott of American alcohol will permanently reshape the U.S. spirits industry's export strategy? Or will the market eventually return to normal once the tariffs are resolved? The most specific and data-driven answers get pinned at the top. Share this with someone who still thinks this trade war is just about dairy and lumber, because the story is now in the liquor aisle and the shelves are still empty.